Cool. All right, guys, let's get started here. So again, welcome everybody to our webinar today, Countdown to Compliance. This is all about SB 707. I'm Jake, your moderator for today. I'm from Treet. So at Treet, we power resale for about 200 apparel brands, including, we do peer-to-peer programs, trade-in programs, off-price returns, a whole lot of things. And this webinar came about after getting lots of questions from both brand partners and prospect brands about 707, how it might impact them, how resale and recycling might fit in, and also just like what is SB 707. And so we have people tuning in that are asking all those questions. So you're in good company with a lot of brands and organizations that are all asking these same questions. You're all in the same boat. Rather than Treet and me trying to answer all these questions, we found two experts to help shed some light on the topic for us. So I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. We have Joanne Brasch and Irys Kornbluth. Thank you so much for joining, guys. And I'd actually like to start by having you two introduce yourselves and a little bit about the companies that you work for and why we're here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks. Iris can go first since I have slides on it.
Awesome.
Nice.
Thank you so much, Jake. This is super exciting. We have a really great group of brands in the audience right now. I am Irys. I'm Chief Operating Officer and co-founder at Everywhere. Everywhere is a textile recycling solutions provider to brands. We provide both straight recycling services, collecting of waste of all different material categories, as well as end-to-end circularity programs. So we are very well known as a specialist in cotton textile to textile recycling, and in many cases can collect waste and actually convert it back into raw materials or products for the brands that we're collecting from. So really excited to be here today, and I'm based in Los Angeles, California.
Amazing. Thanks, Irys. On to you, Joanne.
Thanks. Joanne Brasch, Director of Advocacy and Outreach at the California Product Stewardship Council. We're based in Sacramento. We were the sponsors of SB 707. I see lots of familiar names in the attendee list and excited to connect with new ones as well. Thank you.
Awesome. So to start us off, we're actually going to have Joanne. She graciously volunteered to give an SB 707 overview for everybody. So to provide some context and make sure we at least have a base level understanding before we dig into more questions. And so for the next 5 or so-ish minutes, Joanne's going to share a bit about the bill, talk about the timeline, what we all need to know. And as a heads up, this is all recorded. And so we're going to send a recording of this afterwards. You don't need to frantically write down the timeline or anything like that. We're going to provide these resources for you guys afterwards. And then we're going to, after the few slides, we're going to dig into a Q&A with Irys and Joanne. We got a bunch of audience questions in advance, and I've incorporated some of those into the questions that I'm going to be asking, but a lot of you might be having questions in real time. It looks like the Q&A feature is working, so feel free to add your questions in the chat, and we'll get to those as we have time at the end. Of course, if your question doesn't get answered, we also are going to share our contact info after this so you can reach out to us directly. Without further ado, let's dig in. All right, so first slide, let's.
Thank you. And so as we mentioned, CPSC is a nonprofit. We've been around for 17 years. We're primarily funded by city, county, local government waste authorities, waste haulers, recyclers, and entities in the waste sector that ultimately have challenges with different products that they need the producers of those products part of the solution. So we tend to work on the really hard to manage products. Textiles is not the only product we work on. We also have one of the largest campaigns in the country for safe medicine disposal. We've also had a bill signed last year by the governor on propane and single-use propane cylinders. So ultimately, we work in this space called product stewardship, and extended producer responsibility is just one type of policy. But product stewardship can kind of take different forms of where using policy to encourage better products and better design so that we can safely manage them in the waste sector. Next slide is our vision is ultimately, we don't want a circular economy where the entire waste burden is on garbage ratepayers. part of the thing with extended producer responsibility is it's a new way of funding and keeping dynamic waste programs. You'll hear me talk a lot about bottle deposits and the carpet program or the mattress program we have. Ultimately, what we have is no program is perfect. And so when we think of vision of how to get to a circular economy, we just believe that the role of the producers is throughout the entire life cycle. So SB 707, it's one of the more complex types of bills that has passed in the California legislature. Last year, there were actually 5 extended producer responsibility laws. So textiles was not the only EPR bill that passed, but the governor vetoed 2 of them and signed 3 of them. So there's a lot of things that are in this particular bill that are synonymous with other EPR programs, but there's also a lot of really unique components, given that textiles and clothing and the covered products have unique characteristics. So Senator Josh Newman out of Orange County, his election has not been called, so we don't know if he won his seat for next year. But he was a really great champion and an author of SB 707. He was also the author of a battery EPR bill that we sponsored a few years prior. So finding a legislature who understands not only the topic of waste management, but also understands the process of getting the producers and stakeholders into the conversation to develop good policy. So CPSC, we were the sole sponsors. We sponsor legislation every single year. And one of our skills and our roles in policy advocacy is education, research and development. We gather the evidence, we take the meetings, we develop fact sheets, but ultimately it was a bill that is true extended producer responsibility. That means the advanced recycling fee is paid by the producers. The money doesn't go to the state and the materials don't go to the state. It's truly an industry-run program. CalRecycle does have oversight, and we'll kind of talk about their role, but the beauty of these types of programs is if there's new innovations, if there's new product types that come to the market, the program can adapt to changes in the market without having to go back to new legislation. So we set history in California. So SB 707, the textile EPR bill, is, even though it's the first textile EPR bill in the nation, it is not the first EPR bill in California. It's also not the first textile bill in California. So in California, we actually it was our 14th EPR program, but we set history. It is the first EPR legislation that crossed the finish line with 158 endorsements and 0 opposition on record. The remaining 2 or 3 opposition groups at the end set history. They went into neutral in the second to last hearing, and they really paved way to really set global precedent and a history setting. But ultimately, we've seen this type of policy in other products. But what was so different about textiles is the coalition and the industry that showed up to be part of the advocacy and part of the solution. So we'll talk a lot about what's in the bill, what's not in the bill. Surprisingly, a lot of things that are asked commonly about the bill are, my common response are, that'll be in the plan in 2028. But if you kind of understand how the steps are taken, so once the legislation passed the finish line, that's ultimately the starting line for the agency to begin work. CalRecycle was not authorized to work on any textile programs until this law passed, or any law, really. So really, we were so excited. Actually, on Tuesday, so yesterday, at CalRecycle's public monthly meeting, they announced that the textile website and listserv are officially up. So we're actually seeing CalRecycle be about a month ahead of schedule because they're really excited and they're getting a lot of questions. So the timeline for what's expected of the industry, what's expected of the agency, these are all milestones that are in the bill and they're not going to change. Without setting these milestones, we've seen programs go 10 years down the road without actually accomplishing something. So These are really important to understand because before these milestones pass, there really are not major expectations. But today we're going to talk about opportunities to get prepared ahead of timeline and ahead of the deadline so that you can find ways to best advocate for the regulations, the plan, and ultimately the program implementation for factors that work best for your company and your organization. Some of the really key ones to call out on this slide would be in 2025 is really just workshops. That's when CalRecycle receives feedback. They're not going to be putting out a lot of documents. They'll be hosting in-person and hybrid virtual workshops. By 2026, we're going to see applications and selection of the PRO. The PRO is the program operator. The PRO has to be a nonprofit and it has to have industry representation. But other than that, it's still a competitive process on who CalRecycle will select to be the PRO. The PRO will be running the needs assessment in 2027, simultaneous to when CalRecycle is writing the regulations. The needs assessment completes first, the regulations are adopted second, and that's the starting point for the PRO to write the plan. So 2029 is the really important phase of this program. That's when the PRO is actually drafting the 200-page plan on how they're going to design the program. That's when it really matters the most, in my opinion. But as you can see on this timeline, there's lots of opportunities to get involved between then.
Amazing. So I'm going to stop my screen share right now. Thank you so much, Joanne, for that great overview. I have a couple follow-up questions for you, and then we're going to go to Irys in a bit. I'm curious. So I know a lot of brands are on this call still asking the question, like, what does it mean for me? What does it mean for me financially? What about like how big I am in terms of a company? There's actually another question in the chat just about this, like who does this apply to? I'm curious if you can actually just dig into specifically what it means to them and the financial implications, the potential financial implications, I should say, since a lot of this has yet to be drafted.
So I'll break it down into like three parts, like who's in. So the covered producers are basically if you have $1 million of global sales or more. So there is a small business de minimis off ramp. So $1 million in sales, you're not in the program. If you're selling into California, even if 5 shirts of that $1 million is in California, you're only paying the fee on what you sell into California. The covered products are listed in the law, and you're only paying fees on those products. If the product's not on the list, it's not paying a fee. But what they pay comes out in the plan. First, there has to be a needs assessment and kind of understanding where the gaps are. But ultimately, the fees are going to be designed on what it's going to take to meet the performance requirements that CalRecycle sets in the regulations. So they kind of have to calculate backwards, like here's the expectations, how are we think we're going to get there, and then the fees are set accordingly. But they are eco-modulated. So we've got a couple factors, and we can talk about this later, but it's not a standard fee across every product. And that's where the advocacy is really going to come into play.
Amazing. And I do want to jump back later on and talk about the fee structure and what might reduce fees or increase fees. And I guess the other question is there's fees and then there's fines, right? Yeah. So we have two different topics or places where brands might need to spend money on this. Can you talk a little bit about the fines aspect of things and kind of the difference there?
Yeah, so a fine is if you're found non-compliant, and the fines are $50,000 a day, but that goes to the program operator. The program operator is the entity that is expected to make sure all the producers are meeting the requirements. The PRO will receive the fine. The PRO is the one who has to report to CalRecycle. And so making sure that getting involved in the PRO, making sure the plan is fair and equitable. How those fines are distributed, again, gets written in the plan, but ultimately we want to make sure it's equitable and making sure that if they are receiving non-compliance fines, that they are clearly in the plan stating how they're going to handle those. But ultimately, it's not just coming out of nowhere. The compliance is actually enforced on the annual report. So they turn in the annual report every July. CalRecycle has 6 months to really review it. If there's something they didn't do in that annual report, then it's found non-compliant. So it's basically compliance on the previous year.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Joanne. And I think that $50,000 fine is enough to pique everyone's interest in terms of paying attention and joining webinars like this and staying tuned and becoming compliant. And I'll get to the general questions that are being asked in the chat, but when things jump in that are in real time related to the content that we're discussing, I think it's worth bringing up. Jamie is asking if the $50,000 is per item that is non-compliant, or how the $50,000 is
It's per day.
calculated. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
That
per
would add
day.
up
The
fast.
entire entity is non-compliant.
Got it.
And you're all are not special. We've gotten that fine in probably 5 different product types. And so, yeah, we've got it for pharma, we've got it for electronics. It's a pretty standard compliance fine in California.
Got it. Thanks, Joanne. All right, Irys, jumping to you. And actually, we're going to jump back a little bit and look at this bill from a more macro perspective. I'm curious, in your mind, why is this crucial for the industry right now? Like, what are the macro challenges that we're facing in the apparel industry, and kind of how does SB 707 fit into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, overall in apparel, there's some widely known stats. One of them is that less than 15% of clothing is actually recycled at end of use, and less than a percentage of that amount is actually recycled through textile to textile recycling. So the rates of recycling in apparel are incredibly low, mostly because we haven't had, such regulations in place to really hold brands accountable, which has in turn led to a lack of implementation of infrastructure. And so I think this is a huge step forward. Everywhere we're really blessed and grateful to be based in California, in a state that's, progressing laws like this that are going to help fashion adapt and become more circular. And I think this is really addressed at fast fashion as well. I hate to bring that up, but many brands today are overproducing, and they do need to be held accountable for the end of life waste streams that they're creating. And so I think California is taking a great stand here for that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think California tends to be the model, the guinea pig for a lot of things like this, that I'm sure a lot of other states will follow. This is kind of the first of, I expect and honestly hope, many. And Irys, just to follow up in terms of, I'd love to dig into everywhere just a little bit and how everywhere sort of fits into the picture within SB 707. And I know you guys are going to be a good force to help brands abide by the like legislation and help them along this journey. Can you talk a little bit about that, how everywhere helps brands in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So very complimentary to Treet. Actually, everywhere is geared towards textile products that are no longer usable or resellable. So we kind of take the absolute end of life textiles. And unfortunately, in today's landscape, a lot of apparel is actually not resellable. It's just not made at a high enough quality to be resold. So there's a significant amount of material in circulation that actually does need to go straight to a recycling pathway, and that's where we fit in. So we both collect materials. We collect materials of all different contents, and then we segregate out what we deem are recyclable for textile to textile processes. And for us, that means cotton and cellulosic materials. We do not actually process synthetics back into textiles because we take a pretty hard stance against microplastics. However, we are developing other downcycling waste processing streams for insulation and other types of industrial products for mixed waste and synthetic waste. So yeah, we have all sorts of solutions. Like I mentioned previously, one of them is just blanket recycling, pickup, and processing of material. And then the other is actually a fully circular program where we're not just picking up material from a brand or a client, we're also then converting it back into finished goods or raw materials that they can integrate into their supply chain. So truly helping that end-to-end point making for the circular economy.
Amazing. I think, Irys, we're going to dig in even further later on. But as kind of an immediate next step, I know a lot of brands are thinking, especially after seeing Joanne's slide about, well, 2029 is a really big year, but we have several years to go before that. And a lot of brands are asking themselves, what should they be doing? Like any immediate actions brands should be doing to comply with SB 707, and what they'll need to do in the coming years. So I'd love, Joanne, if you can speak to that just a little bit. I know it overlaps with resale and recycling and other things, but just from your point of view, what are the things, like putting that brand hat on, what, if you were a brand, what would you be doing tomorrow, in the next couple of years, et cetera?
I was a brand, I would be on this webinar. Of course. I think
Yeah.
short term is education, understanding, what's the program? How do I get involved? How does it impact? But we tend to not lean into words like compliance until the regulations are adopted because there's nothing anyone has to do. But we know there's leaders, and we know ultimately everyone who is reading these eco-modulated fees want to get themselves involved and situated to get as low as a fee as possible. So there's a few things that I think, kind of medium term in the next like year, because also we know how long contracts take. And really piloting, I think reuse is really the best. That's really what's prioritized in the bill. Secondhand clothes don't have a fee at all. So that's a really kind of, I'd say, easy first step to prepare yourself for compliance and lower fees. I think understanding recycling and kind of where your product's pathway is to end of life management. Another, I don't want to say easy, but that will be kind of for the brands who want to prepare themselves. And we know that there are no pathways for certain products. And though that's what the program's for, to help the pathways, to help the market development, to help the research and development. So if you want the lower fee, having contracts with recyclers and kind of clear pathways shows that your product is eligible for the lower fees. And then lastly, just kind of the transparency and reporting. I think that's one of the biggest precedents, of the whole program. There's already recycling out there. There's a lot of eco designs out there. But ultimately, we're going to get data and transparency from an industry that has traditionally been a information and reporting, and understanding what you're capable of reporting now, what your recycling and take back partners are capable of reporting. And I think in the next few years, there's going to be discussion of like how to really improve the reporting and transparency. And so really looking at better labeling, better software systems and connecting, different systems. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that you could do in the next year before anything's really expected.
Mm. And so just a few things in summary that stood out. One is if a brand's revenue, a greater percentage of their revenue can come from reuse, which doesn't have the fees, of course, they can earn that revenue for free, and also help reduce their eco-modulated fees across the board, including having recycling paths and additionally increasing transparency across the board. And just I would also begin asking all of your suppliers and partners, obviously Treet as a partner, everywhere as a partner, for all of the data that we can share on where those items are being sold, how those items are being resold, how those items are being recycled, in what quantities, the pounds of items that are being recycled, the fabric composition, all this stuff is going to be really meaningful later on, so that you can decrease those fees and of course just be a more sustainable brand. I think this leans back really well to Irys. My next question for you is similar to Joanne, but more specific about recycling. I'm curious, what advice do you have for brands that are on this call today that have never thought about setting up a recycling program? Maybe they are talking about doing it at some point in the near future. What advice do you have for them about kind of getting started, or what steps they need to take to start thinking about this?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, given that there is some time, quote unquote, to get prepared for this, I do recommend starting with low-hanging fruit. Pretty much every brand that we've spoken to has some form of dead stock material, or returns, like in-store returns that they've collected. So that's like a great material to experiment with and try a pilot or partnership with the recycler. Could be us, could be someone else. There are a number of other resources to look at. But I think getting started now, number one, because there is time to prepare, but it's not that much. And there is likely a very low-hanging fruit waste stream right in front of you, that if you even process it, you'll even save some money potentially on warehousing costs or, space, clearing space. And then I think, not trying to do everything yourself is just a generally good piece of advice. There are qualified partners who have been ramping up on this and working on these solutions for decades even. So there's great partners and resources out there. Happy to suggest some in sort of the webinar follow-up as well. The other thing that I would advise brands to do is make sure you understand the certifications and the requirements. I know with recycled materials, and at least on the procurement side of recycled materials, there are very important standards in the industry. One of them is the Global Recycled Standard. So looking for companies, if they are companies who are offering a fully end-to-end recycling pathway, making sure they have some of those certifications and are properly tracing the materials through their supply chain. And you can see some of those standards on Textile Exchange's platform. GRS is one, RCS is the other. It's, I think, good to just, if you're going to start a program from scratch, to do it with partners who have the right certifications.
Thanks, Irys. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention that as a partner, as a resale partner that also runs take-back programs, you can kill two birds with one stone. So you can launch with a resale partner like Treet that has stackable modules so that you can do peer-to-peer resale and take-back resale, but also connect that to a partner like Everywhere. So all of the take-back goods that need to be recycled can be recycled appropriately, and all that data can funnel back to you. And so there are partners that work really well together, so you can kind of package them together and kill two birds with one stone. But Irys, I want to actually dig in a little bit further and get even more specific. Are you able to share some sort of case study of a brand that you're working with and the details about that deal? What was it? What happened? What were the benefits to the brands? I think it would help paint an even clearer picture.
Yeah, absolutely. We are under an NDA with most of our brand partners, but we've done everything, luxury to sort of more mass market brands in terms of recycling. So just straight pickup, processing, sorting by material content. We do that with a number of brands in LA as well as internationally. I can give one more concrete example in the music industry. We have done work with a band called Paramore. They were recently on tour with Taylor Swift, super cool band. This is a very common use case in music as well. Artists will come back from tour and they won't have sold all their items, and there's actually a significant amount of leftover at the end of the tour. And so what we did for them was collect, upwards of 15 or so pallets of excess merchandise, and are actually making it back into new merch for, their web store launch in like 5-6 months from now. So there's some really cool creative things to do if you have the waste, and also if you have the timeline where this can actually become like a really exciting part of your product line and a great marketing story as well.
So you just mentioned kind of a marketing story. Were there any other sort of benefits that stand out to Paramore, which is awesome that you worked with them? I did not know that. Or any of the other brands that you work with? Obviously, we have, the carrot and the stick. Like with the stick is really like the fines and the fees, et cetera, to do recycling. But when you talk to brands, you've been a business far before SB 707 existed. What are the other reasons that brands are coming to you for these sorts of programs?
Logo destruction. And when I say destroy, I'm not talking about landfill, just pure shredding of logos. So with a lot of excess or returned items, many brands are sensitive to where those logos end up at end of life. So there's a lot of perceived value in just making sure that the brand's IP is fully, destroyed prior to being recycled into any other product, or that the product has less of a risk of ending up in a landfill, point blank. Brands are now being called out for that and how much material they have of their products ending up in landfills. So that's been very important, especially for our luxury clients. They're very protective of their brand. And, even they don't want a lot of materials of their brand ending up, for example, in a thrift store in some cases. And that really depends on the brand. It's like a case by case basis, but I think that's been very valuable for brands. I also think warehousing, we've come across companies who are paying for entire warehouses where they're literally just storing dead stock. And so I think there's a lot of savings to be had there through implementing real recycling processes.
Amazing. Thanks, Irys. And actually, there was a question here about dead stock in the chat that I saw come through. Let me just see if I can find it real quick. It was from Carissa Kelly. She said, material dead stock has more solutions readily available, but what about finished garments inventory solutions?
Yeah, material dead stock. When I mentioned dead stock, I was actually referring to fully finished goods, so actual apparel dead stock. The processing for apparel dead stock, pre-consumer and apparel post-consumer waste is actually very similar. The same detrimming processes need to be done on the garment, the same sorting processes. The material is just a little bit cleaner pre-consumer. So it's a blend of the two different feedstocks, and we're finding that post-consumer collection, is actually taking some time to ramp up. I think there's like an educational gap for consumers where they, need to be educated on how to actually recycle. So we found more consistent quantities available of pre-consumer dead stock, but both kind of require the same types of processing.
Thanks, Irys. Just a couple more questions, and then we can jump into audience questions, more audience questions, both that were typed in through the chat and that were submitted in advance. Joanne, obviously joining webinars like this one are great, but people will be hungry for more resources and seeking other ways to stay informed. I'm curious, can you share kind of what those other resources are, what's available to brands on an ongoing basis to stay tuned?
Yeah, and as I mentioned on Tuesday, CalRecycle announced that they officially made their website and their listserv. That's your number one authority on the program. So it's free. I can put it in the chat once I'm done talking, but ultimately, CalRecycle is the authority. So signing up for their listserv, you'll get the announcements for the workshops. You'll get to read the draft regulations. Once the PRO is selected in 2026, I would suggest signing up for their listservs, joining, following them on social media, and CPSC and advocate groups. I mean, we weren't alone working on this bill. There's lots of nonprofits and advocacy groups. But I think what we had seen in the process is the traditional method of getting information on policy from trade associations was more of a hindrance in the state legislative process. A lot of the trade associations work traditionally is in federal and global trade issues, and getting involved at state policy and understanding the politics in California and the nuances of our agencies. I found in our experience, they can often be gatekeepers more so. So I often encourage cross-pollination, joining advocacy groups, joining listservs, and kind of joining spaces that you can discuss and digest. I mean, lawyers get paid a lot of money to digest these words. So CPSC offers a monthly task force meeting that's going to start in 2025, and we're really proud that it's free of charge. So through sponsorships and opportunities, we're going to continue a free of charge. We used to call it an advisory committee, and actually there was an advisory committee in the bill that got cut. So we felt like, since that didn't make it in the bill, we wanted to still be good stewards and create a space that's free and accessible and equitable for people impacted by the program. But I see quite a few questions about like hats and shoes and footwears and yeah, so going to that list of covered products, and if you make one of those products and you're $1 million of global sales or higher, I would definitely encourage getting involved sooner rather than later.
One of the questions that we got in advance was actually specifically about Treet and Treet's responsibility in all of this. Just to address that question, we see ourselves as being responsible in two ways. The first is, of course, being a partner where we can help companies stay compliant, reduce those eco-modulated fees by running resale programs. And the second is by being a voice on this topic and bringing webinars like this. And so we plan to really make it our goal to help brands like digest this information and speak about it in layman's terms, and bring in more and more experts and partners that can help brands prepare themselves for what's coming. There's a lot of questions also about more questions about who this applies to. There's some questions about like what a producer is, if the brands are not actually producing blanks, or if they're in physical stores. There's also questions about global companies, like if they're not a global company, they're just selling in the US. And Joanne, I wonder if we can just jump back to your original definition of kind of what a producer is, and who qualifies for this, and e-com versus brick and mortar, just trying to get as narrow as possible.
Yeah, so it's based on your global sales is whether you meet that de minimis amount. It doesn't matter if it's domestic or not. What you pay the fee on is what you're selling into California, and it doesn't matter brick or mortar or e-commerce. And the definition of producers is tiered, right? Because if someone doesn't pay, it's going to fall on the next person or entity, not person. And so really it starts with the manufacturer, then it goes to the importer and distributor, then it goes to the license holder. And very rarely it doesn't actually fall on the retailer. But in this industry, a lot of the retailers are the license holders. So ultimately, if you're sourcing from someone who's not paying the fee, it's gonna fall on you. So maybe consider working with your sourcing partners to make sure that they are understanding their requirements. But what we see in reality is sharing the fee across contracts and across partnerships. If it's, let's say it's a 10-cent fee, your fabric producer might pay some, your mill might pay some, but ultimately it comes down to who's putting it on the market. So this example of blanks, or what, and kind of that general, it's when you sell a blank shirt, you're putting it on the market. So if you're selling it to an entity in California, the producer of the blank is paying that. They can choose not to pay it. And then the license holder and the person screen printing, it'll fall on them. And so what we see and what we added to this bill is that anyone in the supply chain can opt in to pay it. And we got that from a few leaders in this space, because they said, a lot of our suppliers, we've been working with them for years. We don't want this extra burden on them. We're just going to pay it and work with them to make sure we're compliant. So there is a provision that says anyone in the supply chain can opt to pay in. And what I think we're going to see is a lot of leadership. If you're offering recycled content, good transparency, all the bells and whistles you need, you're really attracting more contracts and more clients, because you're reducing their burden for compliance responsibility.
Thanks, Joanne. Super helpful. I see another question here from Jennifer Liu, and something that I thought maybe I could address, and Irys also, if you wanted to weigh in as well. The question is there a way to frame to leadership why knowing pathways will help us with future compliance? Still unclear if this will help, if we'll be charged based on units sold. So correct, being charged on units sold no matter what. But as Joanne mentioned, what you will be charged based for those units sold will depend on that like eco-modulated fee. And so you can have the opportunity to reduce those fees by abiding by some of these things that we're talking about here. The other thing that I mentioned that it was a question that I asked Irys, but I'll kind of reframe it to myself a little bit. This sort of like carrot and the stick. So also Treet, we're a little over 3 years old. We power resale for over 200 brands. This legislation didn't exist before we existed, right? So the brands that are today launching resale programs, none of them actually were doing it to stay compliant. They were doing it to drive customer loyalty, to increase revenue, to increase repeat purchases, and obviously, yes, to be more sustainable and keep items out of landfill. That's our goal at the end of the day. And so adding this compliance feature is one more reason for brands to do these things, in addition to that long list of reasons why people and brands were launching resale before, just like they were launching with Everywhere and launching recycling programs before. It's just one more reason, one more like notch on that checklist, if you will.
And really, we modeled the entire program off the leaders we love. So they have not very far to go, if at all, to be compliant. Because, we had leaders modeling good behavior.
That's right. Um, I know there actually we saw that there actually were a good amount of goodwill folks on the call, and we did get some questions about how this will impact collectors like Goodwill. Joanne, hoping you can discuss that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, and I really enjoyed working with Goodwills in the process of getting the policy passed. Because when you think about what existing infrastructure exists in our communities, I mean, Goodwill is one of the largest owners of that infrastructure. So getting their involvement was really key. We also realized when we did the calculations, if every single Goodwill participates, the program still won't meet their collection requirements. So really, it's favoring all collection infrastructure. So nonprofits and retailers of secondhand are prioritized because we want people dropping off where they can buy the products we want them to buy. So that's why there's a prioritization of nonprofits and secondhand retailers as collection sites. And ultimately, when we look at investing in the gaps of the missing infrastructure, a lot of that's going to be changing over the next few years. And so working with the leaders in this space already, so whether it's brick and mortar collection, mail back, kiosks, temporary events, the program is actually collection agnostic as long as there's a minimum physical spots per capita. That's how we measure convenience of the program, knowing that the average resident doesn't have to drive too far or doesn't have to change their behaviors to just drop it off. The rest of the details are kind of back house, all the sorting, all the recycling. The public doesn't really see that level of detail. And I often tell people you've probably participated in an EPR program and had no idea.
Question for Irys. This is from Jamie, and it's specifics about your sorting process. Jamie's wondering if the sorting process is manual, i.e. like with humans, or is there some sort of mechanized sorting technology? Is there some software, AI? What's involved with that process? I'm sure you get, dealing with tens of thousands of units, potentially hundreds of thousands or more a year. What does that look like on the back end?
Yeah, well, the great news is this is a very rapidly evolving area. There's been a lot of innovation in textile sorting, and there's some super cool new startups that are doing AI textile sorting. One of them is called Refiber's, great company up in the Bay Area. To date, the process has been mostly manual, but as of recent, there are some pretty high accuracy scanners. A lot of them are handheld scanners. They detect fiber content with up to like a 7% accuracy. Some of them are getting better at that. There are also conveyor belt sorting systems that will detect material content, again with sort of a tolerance of accuracy that hopefully we will see improved over the next few years, if not decade. But I do suspect that this technology is going to evolve very quickly and actually become highly accurate. So hopefully, this will become less of a labor, manual labor intensive process. Right now, it is fairly manual with the assistance of some of those scanners.
Joanne, this question's for you, and it's from another participant named Jamie. Lots of Jamies here. And this is I think it's a really good question and a very fair question. Jamie's asking, will there be any mechanisms put in place to prevent companies or brands from just paying fines to circumvent the legislation if they view the cost to comply greater than the cost to pay?
Yes. There are a few mechanisms, but hopefully $50,000 a day is enough.
Seems pretty high. I think there's
I
only
mean, if
two
they can
brands in the
afford
world.
that, and
Yeah.
I'm available to hire, but ultimately, I mean, we got it to the point where the equity is in the reporting and due process before those fines come. That being said, we have seen behavior where they just kind of take that risk. So I think in this product type, in this program, there's a few other mechanisms that really help kind of push that forward. So one of them is a sales ban. If a producer is found non-compliant, not participating in the program, and the PRO shows that they did their due diligence to recruit them, notify them of their obligations, then yeah, there's a sales ban. Then lastly, if a or not lastly, secondly, if a retailer is caught selling non-compliant brands, there's also mechanisms there. But I think the most important mechanism for this product type, which is not the same for others, is CalRecycle will host a list of non-compliant brands publicly. And I promise you, there's enough watchdogs in the space. If Shein and Temu end up on that list, there's gonna be a heyday of lawsuits and education and advocacy. So I will say, I think that list of non-compliant brands is so important for this product type because it's consumer facing. That list of non-compliant pharmaceutical brands might not have the same impact because we're not buying those or interacting with those brands. So yeah, there are other mechanisms. So it's not just like pay to play or pay to opt out. But ultimately, yeah, I think the transparency is where we're going to really get what we need and what we couldn't get in the bill. I mean, there were things that we couldn't get in the bill, like overproduction really interferes with the capacity of commerce, right? And dictating the material flows interferes with multi-state commerce law. So there are things that couldn't get into the bill that we can use the data to design future interventions to really help.
Thanks, Joanne. So obviously one of the immediate things also brands are being asked to do, and we're getting a lot of questions about PROs and how to find out about them, what are they, how to join them. I think the obvious question is like, what is the next thing a brand has to do when it comes to a PRO? How do they join it? Where do they need to sign up? I know that they doesn't even exist yet, so that's probably part of the question or probably part of the answer, but what do brands need to know now about joining a PRO?
They don't have to join one till it's selected. And if you join one and it's not selected, you are going to have to shift. So, but that being said, I think joining to get involved because it's going to be a competitive process. Traditionally, the PRO is a nonprofit offshoot of the main trade association. So for carpet, for mattress, paint, there's the main trade association, and then they create a nonprofit program operator. So AAFA is the largest trade association for textiles and apparel. They've been in the media saying that they are creating, and I have heard, they've been working on creating that nonprofit. So getting involved in that development, but also there's quite a few others. We've heard some of the program operators out of Canada, out of Europe, who are professional program operators for other product types interested in coming into this one. We've also seen some other nonprofits that are really rooted out of like equity and environmental justice, believe that they could really go to bat and really push the marker and envelope for some of the, equity issues that aren't necessarily as clearly laid out in the bill. But yeah, ultimately, I think it's the fun conversation to watch because the PRO's obligated to show they did stakeholder outreach, they solicited brands, and that they did their research to prepare their financial planning. So I would keep your ears to the wall and keep them, get involved where you can. But ultimately, ask hard questions, push the envelope, and cross-pollinate, because I think some of the alternative program operators really bring some interesting things to the table. I will say, I expect the program to be 100 million plus annual operating budget. So if you're not capable of that size of a budget and actually reporting to an agency like CalRecycle, I think those are kind of the administrative challenges of running a program.
We've used the words reuse and resale and recycle a lot during this webinar. Irys, from your perspective, I'm actually just curious to know, how does reuse, what is like the reuse recycle relationship like? And I know there was a question from Jackie about Jackie in the chat about are brands encouraged to partner with nonprofits that promote reuse before recycling? I'm curious how everywhere views that sort of the relationship between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. From our perspective, if a product can be reused before recycled, it should be reused as many times as it possibly can. Of course, that that can be up to the brand. Like I mentioned before, most of our luxury clients kind of prefer to do that curating themselves because they really want to control the image of their brand and products in the marketplace. And so I think it varies, but our, ethical stance on that is yes, like resale before recycle, like end of life of a product, it should not be wearable or resaleable. And who's deciding that really depends on it depends on the brand.
Yeah, absolutely. And
I will
couldn't agree
say though, in
more.
the plan, there will be usability criteria. So if you're taking and collecting materials from the public, so not through like private partnership, if you're taking materials from the public, there will be criteria on how to sort for reuse. And if the program finds that people are not sorting and they're sending usable products to recycling or unusable products to reuse markets, they lose their contract or they risk fines. And then lastly, we haven't talked about repair because if I could
Oh
have
yeah.
decided how to call the bill, I would have called it a repair bill. We set global precedent with repair. And not only in its operations, but in its prioritization of grants, prioritization of subsidies and fundings to repair. And in our definition of repair is upcycling, laundering, and preparing for reuse, because we know ironing, tagging, putting it on the hangers are costs to businesses. So I also want to put that plug because that repair
Yeah.
category is actually the one I'm the most proud of.
That's a great plug. Thanks for bringing that up. Absolutely. I think it goes hand in hand with recycle and reuse. It just goes back to using that same item longer, all the things that you can do. So if you're looking at an item and it can easily be repaired to extend the life of that item, that's your best way of reducing its carbon footprint over time. We're almost out of time. I just want to wrap up here. And again, if you didn't get your questions answered, please don't fear. We actually, let me go ahead and screen share while we wrap up. You can feel free to email any of us, or you can scan these QR codes for reaching our websites or scheduling meetings. But between you, Joanne, and Irys, I'm curious, what are your wrap-up takeaways? Like, what are the one or two things that you hope every brand leaving this webinar will take from it?
Yeah, I can jump in and say, there are really great existing partners in this space. So I think starting to have these conversations now and really troubleshoot like how the existing resources available can support you is really the best way to start. And as Jake was kind of mentioning earlier, I think it is about the network of partners. Like we're all very complementary. And so setting up what that looks like for your business is really the best place to start.
Yeah, oftentimes Treet will work with a one or two 3PL partners and a recycling partner, and obviously we're the resale partner. And it's the thing where the people focusing on their lane are best at their lane, and they're also best at integrating with and working with other partners that do that sort of thing. Joanne, on to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think don't be afraid to lean into innovation and partnerships and change. I think there's a lot of even consultants in this space that are really facilitating the change. But I also want to encourage you to look internally. When you look at your own team and ideas and opportunities, sometimes there might be things that come up. Like we have the most fun working with designers because they have so many ideas and really having your government affairs sitting down with your design team and really closing the loop on communication internally. I bet you there's a lot of things you've done internally or past pilots that you could maybe reiterate. And don't try to reinvent the wheel. The whole point of this program is to have one collective entity to facilitate all the challenges and large scaling of recycling and repair. So when you feel challenged, and you feel like you hit a brick wall, really looking to the partnerships and other opportunities to get you over those challenges. There's a lot of opportunities.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joanne. I guess I'll also just add, as Joanne was talking about how challenging this is, and it's definitely going to be a challenge. And I think a lot of brands are looking at these as big obstacles and might be feeling overwhelmed. But you can really view this as an opportunity. There are ways to strengthen your business by doing these things. And so brands that have recycling programs, that have resale programs and take back and repair build stronger businesses for the long term. They're not only more sustainable from an environmental standpoint, but they're also more sustainable financially too. So there's like a quick reframe if you can do that. It's also not as hard as you think to get started. Most of the brands we launch and work with, they look back at the onboarding and say, wow, I wish we did this sooner because it only took 30 days to get a live site going. And so there's these little low-hanging fruit things that you can do to dip your toe in the water. You have some years to do it, but the longer you wait, the more the bigger it feels to accomplish. Thank you so much, Irys and Joanne, for joining. I learned a lot. So it was really fun for me to sit back and put my brand hat on and ask you all the burning questions that I've also been asking myself. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to everybody for joining. Again, we will follow up with this recording. Treet will be sending out recaps of the webinar and hosting other webinars. So stay tuned on our email list for more resources to come. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.